But I had not mentioned the runner-up of the Standard Open, which was James.
Yeah.
Again, making sure that James was reading the newsletter, which he was, and very quickly texted me about, and we had a brief discussion about it. So either way, James Gates, good friend of both of ours in the booth, he's on the right. Kyle Stewart, he's on your left. He's red, white, burn, very similar to the list we saw win last weekend.
Yeah, very close. Boros Reckoner, Chandra's Phoenix, Ash Zealot, and 2 Stormbreath Dragons, same creature base. 4 Boros Charms, some Searing Bloods, Mizzia Mortars, Chain of the Rocks, Chandras, all the usual suspect. So, and alongside 3 copies of Mutavault and some red-white duels.
Gates going to start up with a Sacred Foundry. We're going to see a bunch of those in this particular matchup as we are underway in round number 3 here. Stewart with a Mountain passes the turn back. Red-White Devotion, a deck that we haven't seen a ton of recently. You know, we've seen a lot of different decks in Standard, actually, and this deck has had some success. As you see, Gates is going to play a Frostmourne, but it was kind of pre-Born of the Gods. Now, post-Born of the Gods, it didn't really get very many additions, really any at all, it seems like, but Gates is going to run it back, because this is the deck he got second place with in Los Angeles last time we were here. Ash Zealot here from Stewart, not going to be able to attack through the Frostmourne Weird. He's going to try to do it again.
And I think that Red-White Devotion is incredibly potent against just small creature decks in general.
Yes.
You have Frostburn Weird and Boros Reckoner. Your Nykthos is basically uncontested because they don't have that many ways to remove your permanents from play. And so things like fast Stormbreath Dragons and overloaded Mizzia Mortars can occur very quickly. So Red-White Devotion, a deck that might be inclined to return now that there are so many more aggressive small creature decks popping up in Standard.
You see Gates with a fantastic turn 3. He plays a Burning Tree Emissary, triggers the Nykthos. He's got 4 red mana. He plays a Purphoros. Purphoros is active because the devotion count is at 5. So all of a sudden on turn 3, he's got a Nykthos, which can tap for a bunch of mana, a Purphoros that's already in play that's going to be dealing a bunch of damage, and the 2 other creatures that could conceivably attack. So great start.
Yeah, and this is the power of Red-White Devotion. I think that if your creatures are not getting killed, Red-White Devotion is by some margin the most powerful deck in Standard. When you start running into a lot of Doomblades and Thoughtseizes, things to break up your draw, the deck is not nearly as potent. But against decks that are not really contesting what you're doing, I don't think there's a deck in Standard as powerful.
You know, the thing that's really scary about this deck, and we haven't seen this card see a lot of action since Born of the Gods came in, is the card Nykthos. You know, it was kind of one of the hallmarks at Pro Tour Theros in Dublin, everyone really trying to work to break Nykthos. People have really moved in different directions, and I don't think anyone's really been trying to break Nykthos recently. And this is a deck that really utilizes Nykthos very well. And, you know, if people aren't prepared to actually break up Nykthos strategies, it can really prey on the format.
Yeah, and green devotion lists play a similar role. I think the red list is a little bit more consistent as it can play something resembling a normal game. The green devotion lists are very polarized, and you're seeing, you know, James has a Frostburn Weird and a Burning Tree Emissary in play. He can kind of play normal nuts and bolts Magic, and when his Nykthos is uncontested, he can do some spectacular things.
Tough Guy Purphoros heads into the red zone, attacks for 6. You got a follow-up here of a Fanatic of Mogus. You're going to get your Purphoros trigger for 2 damage, and you see James counting devotion symbols of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we're going to have a total of 8 damage come across here. It's going to knock Stewart down to, I believe, 4 once the dust settles, and Gates will happily pass the turn back. It may be 6. We'll make sure our life totals are up to speed here in a moment.
It's a lot, and it's going to warrant some pretty specific responses for Kyle here.
Sacred Foundry here from Stewart. He'll take 2 more points of damage. We'll see if he has anything resembling a good follow-up, as he's underneath a lot of trouble right now.
Yeah, I think Red-White Devotion's game 1 against decks that are just some creatures and some spells is really, really good, and you're seeing why.
Chain of the Rock's going to take care of Purphoros. We'll see if Kyle has a follow-up play here. He does have a War Leadership in the hand, Boros Reckoner, some other things. Nothing crazy going on. Gates is going to quickly draw his card. We'll see if he's got anything else, to fuel into that Nykthos.
And he doesn't need much because he actually is very close to killing Kyle with exactly what's on the board.
So you do see the Red-White Devotion player tap those 3 lands. 4. There's a Mizzia Mortars with Overload.
Yep.
So get those things out of here and attack you for a whole bunch. And that is going to do it. So James Gates is going to win game number 1 here over Kyle Stewart. Red-White Devotion up a game over Red-White Burn. As we're going to head to the sideboards. I know you've got the Burn deck list in front of you. So what can Kyle do to really turn this around?
He's got an Anger of the Gods, 3 Satyr Fire Dancers, 2 Mizzia Mortars, 4 Skullcracks, 2 Spar Troopers, a Chain of the Rocks, and a 2 copies of Faded Conflagration. I think that he just needs to bring in more removal, and I actually think the Fire Dancers could be legitimate here as well, as even though James is playing a red deck, he doesn't have much in the way of removal. It's more of a creature-oriented strategy. So any removal spell is valuable in terms of pinning down James's devotion, which is the real key to the matchup. You saw that first game when James was able to develop his early board uncontested with Nykthos. There's just no way for Kyle to keep up.
Yeah.
What James is doing is way too powerful. So it's really, the pressure's on Kyle here to have a lot of cheap early removal to kill anything, even things like Burning Tree Emissary, potentially add a lot to James's devotion and facilitate very powerful draws. So all removal is good here.
Gate to sideboard, you're going to find 2 copies of Elspeth Thun's Champion, a Boros Guild Gate, 4 Fire Drinker Satyrs, a Singleton Hammer of Perforos to go along with the 2 in his main deck already, 2 Anger of the Gods, 2 Chain of the Rocks, and then 3 copies of Boros Charm. Wouldn't be surprised to see Anger of the Gods coming on his side. I think he knows he's against a smaller red deck. Anger of the Gods is like okay against his deck, but I think it's better against the opponent's deck, and he can actually set it up when he does draw one. So I can see that coming in, like Chain of the Rocks, 2 more copies of those. He's already got 2 in his main deck there. You know, Elspeth, if he thinks the game's going to go longer, as he's kind of the control deck in this matchup, but I don't really love Elspeth against this particular version of Red-White Burn. And then Hammer of Perforos could be okay as a steady stream of creatures. I'm not sure if he needs it or not, though.
Yeah, it's tough. James in this matchup can definitely take the control role. You can get rid of some of your Ash Zealot, Burning Tree Emissary type of creatures, bring in Anger of the Gods, and then use Anger of the Gods behind cards like Frostburn Weird and Boros Reckoner to really constrict Kyle's board. The fact that Kyle is playing a burn strategy, he's not just all in on creatures, means that it isn't necessarily the best line for James to take, as he can lose to other components of Kyle's deck.
Yeah. So we're going to see these players play game number 2 here in just a moment. But if you guys are just joining us, Cedric Phillips, Patrick Sullivan, Star City Games Open Series here in Los Angeles. 1 weekend till our first Invitational, man.
Yeah, I know. It feels like it's really flown by, and it's really sweet. You know, obviously you and I have been doing commentary for Star City Games for a number of years now. And in previous years, it sort of felt, you know, the Opens are cool and the Invitationals are exciting, but there's no larger picture that's being built up the whole way through. These shows, it feels like every Open is connected to something larger, whether it's the Invitational for that season or for the Players' Championship at the end of the year.
Yeah.
And it makes doing these Opens even more fun.
Nice weekend in Charlotte. That's when the fireworks kind of go off. We'll have 2 players qualified for our Players' Championship at the end of it. And, you know, again, this tournament, along with the Grand Prix in Cincinnati, kind of set the texture for what we're going to see next weekend as far as both Standard and Legacy are concerned.
Yeah, and it's really intriguing so far on camera. We've had Ben Lundquist, even though he didn't have a good tournament, and James Gates play decks that are, I would say, off the Standard radar. It's not that these decks are unknown, but rather that very few people are choosing to play them. And James and Ben are both very experienced, very skilled Standard players, and they're going by their faithful decks.
See, Kyle's going to take a mulligan here. James taking a look at his opening hand. Looks like he's happy enough with it, but we will see if he does send it back or not. And it looks like he is going to keep as he does set it down here and patiently wait here for Mr. Stewart. But yeah, just a lot going on right now in Magic. Really just interesting stuff between this tournament. We got the Grand Prix in Cincinnati. We got the Invitational next weekend. Again, you know, 2 invites to the Players' Championship going to be given out next weekend. Start of season 2 happening. As you mentioned, just the bigger picture stuff that's kind of happening with the end of your Players' Championship just really changes the landscape of the Open Series.
Yeah, it's really exciting.
Yeah. I can dig it. Players chasing points. You've got players, big name players going to invitational qualifiers too, like we saw last weekend with Brad Nelson, Chris Van Meter, and Brian Braun to win, going to invitational qualifiers. Super IQ won by Brian on Saturday. A regular IQ in Charlotte at the Dugout won by Brad Nelson on Sunday. So it's always cool to see the locals, the pro players go to the local shops too and hang out with the locals and do some battling there. I know a lot of the players at those local stores, it was a really good experience for them to be able to do battle against the big pros who they read about on the website.
It's definitely sweet.
We've got a Temple of Triumph here from Kyle Stewart. He will scry. Looks like he's going to keep that card on the top potentially, as you see him take a look at his hand, and he will, as Gates is going to untap nothing. He'll take a draw.
And it does look like Kyle has brought in the Fire Dancer.
Not too surprising.
Yeah, I think it's good for this matchup.
There's a Boros Guild Gate before Gates does pass the turn back. Kyle draws a Sacred Foundry, so not too surprising as he's going to play a Mountain. We'll see what he wants to deploy on his second turn. And he will go with a Satyr Fire Dancer. You see Gates is going to take a look at that. We'll do the same. The Born of the Gods rare. Whenever an instant or sorcery spell you control deals damage to an opponent, Satyr Fire Dancer deals that much damage to our creature that player controls. So you go upstairs and you take care of a creature on the way.
Everything is a Searing Blaze.
Yeah.
And your Searing Blazes are super Searing Blazes.
True, true. Here's a Frostburn Weird from Gates. It's already starting to work towards the Devotion. We'll see if he has a Nykthos this game as well. Obviously, the best land in his deck. And as long as he's able to facilitate that, he'll be in good shape. As Stewart is going to play a Sacred Foundry tapped. He's going to add some mana to his mana pool. We'll see what the spell's going to be here. He does have a Chain of the Rocks. Looks like he has a Boros Charm, so he's going to deal 4 upstairs, and then Fire Dancer's ability will actually take care of Frostburn Weirds. So good use of Boros Charm there.
Great start here for Kyle, developing his board and also keeping James's under wraps.
And already knocking James's life total a little bit low. He's down to 16. The attack from the Fire Dancer will actually put Gates down to 15. But more importantly, he's keeping that devotion count low.
Yeah, you saw when James went unmolested in the first game, his opening was outstanding.
Rather one-sided affair in that first game, as Gates will take a draw here.
But the red devotion deck can actually be fairly anemic when his board's getting contained.
Yeah.
It plays just like an underpowered mono red beatdown deck when it's not doing powerful nick those things.
Gates going to play a Mountain. There's Boros Reckoner, pass the turn back. We know Stewart has an answer for that in his hand with Chain to the Rocks and the necessary Mountain to put it onto. So a Lightning Strike the draw for the turn.
Yeah, it's really important to have Chain of the Rocks here too, as he does really want to keep his Fire Dancer, and so he can't afford to have Boros Reckoner be triggering through burn spells.
Now the follow-up play is going to be an Ashes Zealot, so he'll be able to come across for 3 points of damage here. Gates is going to go down to 12, and still with no board.
Yeah, and that's why, you know, even though this is definitely a burn deck, it is something of a misnomer to call it just a burn deck, as it can play a, you know, Jackal Pup game alongside its Lightning Bolt game.
Patrick, it's Fire Drinker Satyr now. It's no longer Jackal Pup.
Sure.
Okay. You need to update yourself.
It's an icon. We always call it.
There's a new Jackal Pup.
We don't call it Consecrated Sphinx. We call it Mahamodi Dijin when we're talking about big blue flyers. There's a precedent set by the classics.
I suppose that's true. But Consecrated Sphinx is much better than Mahamud Dijin.
Right. It's not about power level. It's about iconicness.
I just like new things. It's a Temple of Triumph here from Gates. You can take a look at the top card, figure out where he wants to put that.
The original Fords, they're slower than present-day Honda Civics, but the Ford is an icon because of history. That's a thing that exists. That's a concept that's important.
Yeah, I suppose this is true. Here's another copy of Boros Reckoner. Gates will pass the turn back. Stewart's going to draw. It's another copy of Vassal to go along with 2 Lightning Strikes in his hand. Lightning Striking and Boros Reckoner, not the best.
Yeah, I mean, Kyle does have the option of Lightning Striking James, redirecting to the Reckoner, and mitigating some of the damage, but Boros Reckoner is a nightmare for aggressive red strategies. Yeah. Even when Kyle has, you know, a lot of good answers for it in his deck and a lot of good secondary plans to beat it, like just burning out James or something like Fire Dancer, it's a headache.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the most exciting play to Lightning Strike James, Fire Dancer's trigger, target the Boros Reckoner, but I think it's this kind of thing where you just need to get it off of the table because, again, that's something that provides devotion as well.
Yeah, it's unclear what other options Kyle has. I mean, does he just want to sit back and say go? That doesn't seem like a winning strategy.
You see he's going to attack in here for 2, he thinks. Not entirely sure exactly what he wants to do this turn.
I think that if he attacks with just Ash Zealot, James will block faster than we've ever seen a human being block.
I am inclined to agree with you, my friend.
I don't know what you got, but we're gonna find out.
Yes, we are. It'll be a snap block, as the kids call it these days. Again, it's not an exchange of resources that I think Kyle wants to make, but I think it's an exchange of resources that Kyle has to make. And you see him pull a Lightning Strike forward, and he is going to go, looks like upstairs with Lightning Strike, trigger Fire Dancer, and target that. Yeah.
Yeah, I understand this is not awesome for Kyle, but he certainly can't let James just untap with that Boros Reckoner and not attack this turn.
So you got to do what you got to do situation there. That's what that is. So after the dust settles, Ash Zealot's going to die to Boros Reckoner's trigger. Fire Dancer's going to come across. It's going to put Gates down to 8. And Stewart, with a Lightning Strike and Ash Zealot, will pass the turn. Gates is going to untap those 4 lands. He's going to take a draw. And we'll see what he's got to do on his 5th turn of the game, as he's not been able to get a board together at all this game.
Yeah, I mean, Kyle's mulligan this game even, and he's in such a better position just because he actually has ways to interact with what James is doing, which he had very little of in the first game.
Gates finds his one-of Chandra Pyromaster, uses that ability, takes down the Satyr Fire Dancer, and is going to play a Sacred Foundry tap before passing the turn. So really nice turn there for Gates. He's trying to catch back up. That's a card that's going to be able to provide devotion. That's going to be difficult for Stewart to get off of the board. You see Ash Zealot's going to come into the red zone. It's going to knock Gates down to 6, deciding to go after Gates' life total as opposed to the Pyromaster.
Yeah, he's got James within closing distance here. He's not really worried about James's board so much at this point. Kyle's at a healthy life total. He can afford to even take a hit from something like Storm Breath Dragon, just trying to finish out the game before James finds his more powerful tools.
One thing Gates does not have in his deck is any way to gain life. Typically, when you see a red-white deck, you think of War Leader's Helix, but that's not a card that he has access to in his deck, unsurprisingly, as this is a devotion strategy as opposed to what Stewart is doing. Gates is going to turn over the top card of his deck with Chandra, play that Burning Tree Emissary, trigger, going to put another Burning Tree Emissary into play, trigger some more mana.
Got some fireworks coming potentially.
Potentially. He's working his way towards a board now, finally, but he's doing it at 6 life as opposed to like something like 16.
This would be the type of turn where if James had a little more breathing space, he could potentially turn the game around in really short order.
Well, this does a nice job of turning the game around. Here's a Fanatic of Mogus, and that's going to be a trigger. You count the devotion there of 7. It's going to put Stewart down to 13. See if Gates has anything else to do on this turn. Looks like he may have a land to play. He does with a Sacred Foundry and just passes the turn back.
And this is a lot of pressure. Keep in mind in all of this that, you know, if Kyle can't even hang back on defense with his Ash Zealot because Chandra can make it unable to block.
So he put the Lightning Strike upstairs. He puts Gates down to 3. No cards in Kyle's hand as he goes to his turn. See if he found something.
It is.
I think this is a War Leader's Helix. It is. That's going to go upstairs. And it looks like that is going to do it. And James trying to say, you want to target Chandra, right? And Kyle says, no, actually you, because it's lethal. So we're going to play a third one here, Patrick.
Yeah. Much better setup for Kyle post board with some actual ways to interact with James.
Yeah. Really, really important there. And you see the power of Satyr Fire Dancer in that game. A card that you typically don't think is good against red decks, but again, the red-white Devotion deck isn't one that has a ton of removal. There's a couple Mizzy Mortars hanging out and then some number of Chain of the Rocks, and that's it.
Yeah, it's a Devotion deck first and a red deck second.
Yes. You're not going to find Shocks or Lightning Strikes or any of that stuff running around here.
Some of the decks do have that kind of stuff going on the sideboard because it's valuable in the beatdown matchups to just have cheap and fast ways to interact, but once you're on a Nykthos plan and you have Perforos as well, every spell comes at the cost of a permanent, in theory, and your permanents are at a premium.
And that game is a really good, I think, display of why people really tried to work towards Satyr Fire Dancer when it was released in Born of the Gods. Is because, you know, if that card lives, it has such a huge impact on the game, making your burn spells obviously incredible as opposed to just very good. And, you know, maybe a deck like this or a deck based around Satyr Fire Dancer needs a little bit more firepower for maybe the next journey into Nyx, but you can certainly see why people tried to move that direction. Brad Nelson, some of the other players.
Yeah, the challenge with it is, in my mind, in Standard, to get really efficient burn spells to maximize the power of that card, you're looking at things like Boros Charm and Skullcrack. That's the most efficient mana to damage ratios that you get. Those are burn spells that can only target players. So when you have those cards alongside the Fire Dancer, that's great. And you saw in that game, you know, Boros Charm, you kill your Frostburn Weird, and so forth, very powerful. The problem is that if you don't draw your Fire Dancer or your Fire Dancer dies, you're left with a bunch of Skullcracks and Boros Charms against beatdown decks, and that's a hard way to win the game.
Yeah.
So when everything comes together, it's really, really good, and if you read it in deck lists, it makes a lot of sense. Like, oh, okay, this card alongside Boros Charm is just insane. But there are some problems when you're actually playing the games that you wouldn't necessarily think of when you're just looking at decks on the deck list.
So we see both players going to the drawing board here for game number 3. Stewart taking a little bit more time. Does anything change here since he's on the draw for game 3?
He may want additional cheap removal spells even more so than he did before, but I don't think anything changes in a substantial sense just because, you know, all the cards that were good there are still good. It's possible that he's going to want to, say, remove Ash Zealot from his deck while he's on the draw, because it's just very unlikely the pieces come together. James has Ash Zealots of his own, Boros Reckoner, Frostburn Weird, just so many good answers. You can potentially suspect Anger of the Gods as a card that he's brought in against you. So the idea that Ash Zealot is productive in a game is kind of a distant fantasy.
2 cards that I really like in Kyle's sideboard as well here before we do start game number 3. 2 4-mana spells that haven't seen a lot of play. We've got Fated Conflagration and Spark Trooper.
Well, Fated Conflagration is a really versatile spell for these burn strategies. It can kill Polychronos, it can kill Blood Baron, it can kill Jace, Architect of Thought, a lot of really good targets, and scrying is so valuable for the burn decks. I wrote in my article, I feel that burn is scry is more valuable to burn than to any other archetype because the lands versus spells polarization is most pronounced there. When you're trying to burn someone out every single spell you draw matters, and every land that you draw is a disaster. So having some manipulation on that front is really important. It's part of the reason Magma Jet is one of the more powerful cards in the deck, because you almost don't care what spells you're drawing, you just care that they're spells. And the lands are a disaster to be drawing in a lot of spots.
How do you feel about Spark Trooper?
Really powerful sideboard card for certain matchups. I've certainly lost to it plenty. I think it's also good against green mid-range decks that aren't necessarily anticipating it. Really, you know, I played that card in the sideboard of my Boros deck at Pro Tour Dragon's Maze in the block constructed portion. I actually liked it there primarily for the Esper matchup because I was in the market for just more haste creatures against that deck.
Okay.
But there's a number of opponents it's powerful against, and when you have so much powerful burn, it's another way to finish the game out. Also, gaining life is weirdly meaningful for this deck because that translates to more draw steps to find the last burn spell.
Sure. It's really a swinging effect in the red mirrors, too.
Yes. I mean, it's not great all the time because, you know, this deck is playing Ash Zealot and Chandra's Phoenix, so you already want cards like Shock and Searing Blood especially. So Spark Trooper is not good 100% of the time. It is a disaster, actually, on occasion. But it does have a lot of upside in a variety of matchups.
Yeah, and you know, it's a situation, too, where if you don't have the answer at the right time, it really just does change the game in a big way. So we'll see if Kyle opted to board those in or not. But Game 3 is going to start with James Gates on your right. He has the option to play first, which he obviously took as he's taking a look at his opening hand, and we'll see if he's able to find a Nykthos fueled draws. He's going to start with a Sacred Foundry before passing the turn back.
I'm not a huge fan of having that card in this matchup, of having Spark Trooper, because Kyle has to be containing James's board. It's not about the damage race. If James wins, it's going to be probably by some overwhelming edge.
Okay. There's a Mountain, and there's an Ash Zealot, so Gates is going to come across for 2. First blood, as it were. Stewart going to go down to 18. Stewart has a Mountain to play. You see he does have a Lightning Strike, a Searing Blood, plenty of removal spells in his hand, that's for sure.
And Searing Blood, a really powerful tool for these burn decks.
And the one thing I think, and I like this play a lot here because it seems really simple, but I like killing the creature right away, so there is no, Nykthos nonsense that takes place.
Also, Searing Blood actually has to resolve. It's not Searing Blaze,
Correct.
where the damage happens to the player no matter what. It actually has to resolve to deal the 3 damage and successfully kill the creature. So there's no point in risking something weird happening by allowing James to untap and potentially have an answer.
Gates going to take 2 off a Sacred Foundry to play a Boros Reckoner. As you mentioned, one of the best cards in this matchup. As Stewart's going to untap those 2 lands, he'll take a draw. It's a Mountain. We'll see if it's a card like Chain of the Rocks. You see he does have a Boros Reckoner in his hand. He also has a Lightning Strike, a Mizium Mortars, like a Chandra Phoenix as well. So his hand is loaded up right now for this matchup.
Yeah. Although the Reckoners are still very annoying for Kyle to play against.
Yes. One of the things that Reckoner kind of stresses and forces you to have is, Chain of the Rocks, like, immediately.
Yeah, although on an empty board where the Reckoner trigger is going to not kill anything of Kyle's, it's not the end of the world to use something like Mizium Mortars or Lightning Strike, because again, James is not really playing an aggressive red deck. If he wins, it's by having an overwhelming board. I'm not saying the 3 or 4 damage doesn't matter, but James could not afford to do this play to Kyle because James's life total is very sensitive.
Yeah.
Kyle has a little more wiggle room to play with.
So Kyle had the option there, as James is going to untap, he'll take his turn, and we'll catch you guys up on that in a moment. But Kyle had the option to cast a Lightning Strike or Mizium Mortars on Boros Reckoner. He opted to go with Mizium Mortars. How do we feel about that?
Well, he is trying to assemble lethal burn. The extra point of damage probably is not as important. The extra damage that Kyle takes is probably not as important as Kyle having the option to Lightning Strike James if the game goes down that road.
Boros Reckoner here from Stewart, see if he has a 4th land to play. He does have a Sacred Foundry and a Boros Guild Gate, so he is good to go in the land department as well. Puts in a play tapped and passes the turn back, as all Gates did on his previous turn was cast a Brain Emissary, pass the turn back. So again, we saw in the first game what happens when everything goes perfect for Gates. He's able to fuel powerful Nykthos draws, go absolutely bonkers. But he hasn't been able to do that in the second game, and he's having difficulty doing in this game as well.
Yeah, his draw is definitely objectively worse right now than it was in the first game. But more importantly, Kyle just has more ways to break up what James is doing, something that he didn't have as much access to in the first game.
Gates just draws and passes the turn back as Stewart draws a Boros Charm for the turn. So not even a card like Chain to the Rocks there in Gates' hand to take care of the Reckoner.
And you can see the value now, Kyle getting rewarded for keeping the Lightning Strike in his hand instead of the Mizium Mortars, as Kyle, with that Boros Charm draw, is now getting James really into range.
You see 3 mana being tapped here on the main phase. This is a Chandra's Phoenix. Into the red zone comes the 2 creatures. We'll see if Gates has any blocks here, but he's getting into really dangerous territory here. Let's say he just takes this damage, goes down to 10. Boy, you got a Boros Charm and Lightning Strike. That's 7 points of damage. It only takes 1 more.
Yeah, and this is the squeeze of Boros Reckoner, of course, is that James can't even really chump block it.
Yeah. So we'll see if Gates does take kind of rock and a hard place, which is chump blocking here. Maybe he kills his own creature with a Magma Jet style effect. He doesn't really have a lot of those, or if he just has to take 2 points of damage. So here we go. You see 2 damage is going to come across from the Reckoner. The trigger is going to put Gates down to 11 after all is said and done, and Gates will draw a card for the turn. He does have a copy of Anger of the Gods in his hand, but because Stewart has that Boros Charm, Gates could be in for a pretty rude awakening here.
Yeah, or Kyle can even say, okay, that resolves, shoot you with the Reckoner, and now I still have Boros Charm left over. I think because keeping the 2 creatures in play is worth 5 damage next turn at the minimum, he's going to use this Boros Charm, but it's not even mandatory.
You see Kyle's going to make sure that he's doing this all correctly here, because he does tap the 2 mana immediately. It looks like he may be casting Indestructible Form on Boros Charm. He may not, though, as you did mention. He might be fine with this resolving. And he's going to ask a question to the judge.
And here's the thing he may be asking about is, does the Boros Reckoner still trigger when it is indestructible and being dealt damage? The answer is yes. The damage still gets dealt. I got this lesson in a very rude fashion in a match a few days ago online, so I know this interaction.
That's good. You learned the hard way.
Oh, I did. It was really bad. I actually had to suicide a bunch of 2/1s into it to then try to finish it off with Searing Blood.
Okay.
So this was a mess.
Yeah, there's no way you won this game.
No, yeah. I did not actually get to untap in this game because the game ended the following turn. So I can definitely confirm this interaction.
Yeah, so again, if Kyle uses his Boros Charm to make everything indestructible, the 3 damage from the gods will still be dealt. The Boros Reckoner trigger will still happen, allowing him to deal 3 damage to Gates, put him down to 8, and then he'll have the 2 creatures in play.
Plus the Lightning Strike in hand that we do know about.
Yeah.
So assuming that Kyle gets the proper ruling, understands all the interactions here, and can do the math, he actually has James dead.
Yep. So we'll see what does happen when he comes back to the table. But, there's this... this is kind of the problem with the red-white Devotion deck, and Devotion decks in general, is that it really, really leans on having creatures in play for the Devotion and then actually drawing Nykthos, something that Gates was unable to do in the 2nd and 3rd game.
Yeah, it's noteworthy. People often just playtest game 1s.
Yes.
The majority of when you and your buddy are playing at the store, you're just running game 1s back and forth against each other for the most part. And in game 1s, Devotion decks look incredible. Post-board games almost invariably get harder for Devotion strategies because they're just playing against more removal spells.
Yeah. So here is Boros Charm. It's going to go indestructible. Anger of the Gods going to be placed in the graveyard. Oh, it's on Kyle to make sure he remembers the Boros, the Boros Reckoner trigger. And you see Gates is going to pick up his lance and say, all right, you've got me beat. So that is going to do it. Kyle Stewart is going to win this match over James Gates. 2-1, and Red-White Burn is going to move on to 3-0, proving that Seattle, maybe not a fluke.
No, I mean, this deck is legitimate.